Hey folks, so here's the last of our lectures about the digestive system. We're going to focus kind of on the dirty back nine of the alimentary canal here, looking at the specializations and the function of the colon, a little bit about how defecation is controlled, and then also some about how particular foodstuffs in the diet are going to be enzymatically digested and then absorbed in different parts of the alimentary canal. Relatively fewer number of SLOs here. There's a certain amount of overlap between the last couple of the SLOs and the next chapter, and if you've had human nutrition. So I'm going to go through those, relatively quickly. Okay, so here the large intestine is connected obviously to the end of the distal part, the ileum of the small intestine. It's gated by a one-way valve called the ileocecal valve that's going to prevent the feces from moving backward into the small intestine. A big part of the reason why that happens is because there are colonies of bacteria that live within the large intestine that really need to be sequestered there, or else it's going to cause it can cause bacterial invasion and blood sepsis eventually. You notice that one place that makes the large intestine different than the rest of the gut is the placement of the cecum here. So there's this little bag that hangs off, like a little cul-de-sac that hangs off the end of the basically the ileocecal junction there. And this is unlike what we see in other parts of the gut. Like the esophagus leads straight into the stomach leads straight into the duodenum. But in this case, there's this little just like this little cul-de-sac that comes off it in the cecum. And furthermore, hanging off the cecum is a vestige of the larger cecum that we identify in other kinds of mammals that we call the appendix. Vermiform is a word that just means worm-shaped. The appendix has a lumen, and it serves as kind of at least as far as we understand it, it serves as a reservoir a source for new gut bacteria to be able to proliferate in the rest of the large intestine. We've become familiar with it through people who have acute appendicitis and have to get it removed. Very common disease in young adults, but people of any age can get it. How it's treated almost varies by the hospital. Even within my family, 3 of the 4 people who live here have had our appendixes out. For 2 of us, it had basically it was removed either laparoscopically or open, depending on what the degree of inflammation was. But in the third, they were given a course of antibiotics first, like allowed to get over the bacterial infection, and then have the surgery later after they went through colonoscopy to kind of get the lay of the land. Then it was done laparoscopically. So even with the 3 of us who live here, we see like some variation in treatment. I think that it's my wife's cooking. Anyway. What happens in acute appendicitis is usually there's a blockage of the opening of the lumen of the appendix in the cecum by a fecal particle. It's called a fecalith. And when it does that, the bacteria that are proliferating inside it start to, are going to kind of increase the pressure within the appendix, and eventually it perforates or ruptures, and it can cause peritonitis, which is, inflammation of the peritoneum by those gut bacteria that are found outside of their normal sequestered area. But that's usually cured by a course of antibiotics. Anyway, just kind of the regions are pretty straightforward. There's the ascending part, the transverse, descending, the sigmoid, S-shaped part of the colon, and then the rectum, the straight part, before you get to daylight. Another thing that's characteristic about it are those little bulges along its wall that are called haustri. And those little haustri are places where they're just these little smaller cul-de-sacs where the feces is going to be kind of where you have the mostly water absorbed out of the large intestine. There are some other things that get absorbed in the gut in the large intestine as well, but the greatest part of the journey here is that food that got taken in and broken down, and then digested with enzymes and then absorbed. Usually the stuff that gets into the large intestine are the indigestible things, or the stuff that just the body didn't have a chance to be able to absorb. So like I think I said in an earlier lecture, these are things that are not going to end up entering the body. by and large. I mean, there's a little bit of, vitamin digestion that happens here, and a small amount of sugar digestion that comes from the metabolism of the bacteria, but there's not a lot of other digestion that happens there. The one thing that's different about the large intestine's movements compared to the small intestine is the large intestine goes through a series of, like, say, 3 or 4 what are called mass movements over the course of a day. So when we talk about these bowel movements, what that means is, instead of just sort of the propulsive or segmentation kinds of movements that we saw in the cranial part of the pipe here, like what we see in the small intestine, say, that's not what we see in this region. Here, the feces just kind of moved forward, like 8 or 12 inches at a time. And though we might hear it, we're usually not totally aware of where the feces is until it gets to the rectum, because that's where the stretch receptors are for that. Now, if we zoom in here on the rectum, there are a couple of sphincters. The internal anal sphincter just looks like it's a part of the wall, but what it is, it's the thickened up part of the muscularis externa, where the those now increased circular fibers, these are autonomic. So as soon as there is stretch in the rectum, as the rectal valve is kind of pushed on, that's going to cause the feces it's going to relax to start to allow defecation. Now, the external anal sphincter, it's a little hard to understand in section here, but if we go back to the previous picture, you see how the external anal sphincter looks like it's kind of wrapped around the colon there, wrapped around the rectum. That's what we're looking at here in cross section. So these muscles, as it turns out, are voluntary. I bring this up here because we're going to see a similar arrangement of internal automatic or autonomic sphincters versus an external voluntary sphincter when we are looking at the urethra as well. So there's going to be an internal sphincter that opens excuse me, as soon as the bladder fills to a certain volume, but it's the external sphincter that you have voluntary control over. Sorry. This is done by a couple of what are called storage reflexes, and then finally the defecation reflexes. So what happens first is, as the rectum stretches when the feces moves into it, that's going to send sensory fibers up to the spinal cord. And then a spinal reflex is going to stimulate the contraction of the rectal walls, and then also the relaxation of the internal anal sphincter. So that first contraction actually happens, the first contractions of the rectum actually happen basically as soon as the feces gets there, but then you kind of get to veto this based on the impulses that are coming from your conscious control, the motor fibers that are going to be regulating the external anal sphincter. This is how delicate, if it is convenient to defecate, basically then you can allow it to happen. But that's part of the reason why when you need to use the restroom but you can't get there yet, a lot of that urge is coming from the fact that the rectum is contracting to try to cause defecation to happen. So what's voluntary is not any push that you would give to defecation, but just to the relaxation of the anal sphincter. And this is something that's learned. It's like automatic but not autonomic, because it's a habit that happens during childhood. So when babies are first getting potty trained, this kind of awareness that they need actually to hold their water or hold their poop is something that takes a while to learn, but you don't have to consciously think about it all day, though you might be thinking about it right now. And you certainly don't have to think about it while you sleep, because it's kind of worked into this sort of kind of more or less reflexive somatic habit. Okay, then to get away from the pipe itself, let's look at a little bit at the different kinds of foods, consider the metabolites that are going to be coming from the polymers, and where those polymers are going to be, where those monomers are going to be absorbed. Okay, so first, looking at carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are unusual in that their digestion actually begins up there in the mouth from the amylase that's produced in the saliva. But it's a relatively small amount of digestion, partly because, food doesn't spend that much time in the mouth now. And, it's going to kind of get diluted by the time it meets up with the gastric acid and other excretions of the stomach. The bigger part of the absorption happens by the pancreatic amylase that occurs in the pancreatic juice. And then there are a number of small enzymes that are associated with the brush border. Like they sit on those microvilli on the mucosal cells in the small intestine. That's where their further digestion is going to happen. And this is largely going to be getting absorbed either by co-transport or facilitated diffusion for getting it into the through the small intestine into the bloodstream. But again, once it gets into the small intestine's blood there, it's going to pass through the liver next to kind of get screened. But again, with things like starches, the monomers of starches are what we call simple sugars, like glucose, fructose, galactose, etc. Those are usually those very smallest ones that are going to be absorbed. Next, we can consider the absorption of proteins. So remember, the proteins are polymers of amino acids. So the goal is going to be to break them up into the smallest possible Legos there. Pepsin does some part of this job to be able to break it up, but more of the work is also going to happen through the pancreatic enzymes that are coming in through the pancreatic juice. And then lastly, the brush border enzymes are going to kind of finish off the job. The greatest majority of the absorption happens in the small intestine here. Just as a note, not a lot of stuff actually gets absorbed in the stomach. I mean, some water can get absorbed there, aspirin, some alcohol gets absorbed there, but not a lot of foodstuffs will get absorbed there. And again, we're mainly looking at like co-transport or facilitated diffusion for their absorption. Lipids are polymers of the monoglycerides and fatty acids, and there are a couple of places where that absorption happens. There's a little bit of enzyme, a little bit of lipase that gets thrown at them in the saliva as well as in the stomach, but the reason why they have minor importance, I think, is because the fat droplets are still pretty large when they're ingested at that point. But once the bile gets applied to the chyme, then that'll help to break it up into small enough parts where those little micelles are going to be able to get worked on by the pancreatic juices at lipases, and then it can get absorbed in through the small intestine. Those can get absorbed through by diffusion in the through the small intestine's wall, but also because of course they're lipid, but they also lacteals, those lymphatic vessels, also do their job to help to absorb stuff through a villus. And then last, nucleic acids. We don't think of nucleic acids as being particularly important for foodstuffs, but it's another thing that the body needs to be able to take in. So most of this happens through the action of the ribonucleases and ribonucleases that come in through the small intestine, and as well as the brush border enzymes, and that absorption is happening there. So when we consider these all together, most of the story is there's some amount of, the pancreas is where the greatest part of all these enzymes are coming from. There, depending on which case we're looking at, like if we're looking at amylases or we're looking at pepsin, there are a few places where we'll have other organs like the stomach or the saliva that are contributing, salivary glands that are contributing to their enzymatic breakdown, enzymatic digestion. But largely, we're looking at the same story over and over again, where the pancreatic juice and the brush border enzymes are doing what I think is the lion's share of the actual enzymatic digestion, and the small intestine, notice implicated in all these places, is where the greatest amount of the absorption of foodstuffs is happening as well. Yep, and that's it. The next lecture is going to be about metabolism and nutrition. It's going to be relatively light on nutrition, not because it's not important, but because for people who really need it, we have a whole course in human nutrition. But I'm also going to talk about metabolism and how it is that how the energy balance of your body works, and how and think about basically where the energy goes that we take in here. Anyway, let me know if you have any feedback about this video. Thanks.